This podcast is an overview of the AP English Literature and Composition course's analysis of William Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, conducted and summarized after class on Thursday, October 18th. You'll see in the notes in this first slide that first thing I did, or would encourage you to do when you are getting ready to enter into this particular poem, is to think for just a second about the place that makes you happy. What is your happy place? I think that particular strategy helps to get you thinking in Wordsworth's way to associate with what is good and true and beautiful in this poem, which I think is one of his favorite things. The second thing we did during class today was to just quickly research several terms that we know might prove important to this poem by Wordsworth. Wordsworth was an English Romantic poet, and so some of his concerns were really personal, and as such he falls within the lyric form of poetry, which typically is more concerned with the emotional and more concerned with, again, sort of a personal apprehension through the senses. So that was something that we talked about applying to this poem, the lyric form of poetry, as opposed to, say, the epic form of poetry. The next term we looked at was the pastoral. Pastoral, if you think of your Latin pastor, pasture, gets back to the idea of sheep. And so we talked about pastoral poetry celebrating the idols of shepherds. And I might as well write the word idols because it's just a lovely thing to think about. These shepherds kind of kicking back out in nature, having a beautiful time. So that is what pastoral poetry typically is very much interested in nature as a way of thinking about the world. We looked at the question of tone. What is Wordsworth's attitude toward his subject or audience as revealed in this work? I believe the word that came up more than anything was wistful or nostalgic, but there were occasions when we also thought about him being ecstatic in this poem that clearly celebrates his coming back to a place that has mattered to him through his associations both with nature and with his sister here. I'll save the sublime for the end because I researched that. I had folks look into what the impulse toward transcendence means, and I believe we've talked about this in class before. The Romantic poets in particular often sought transcendence to go beyond the merely physical or material toward a layer of higher apprehension, the spiritual plane, if you will. So transcendence is some longing for union with some kind of higher order of reality. We talked about the notion of sympathy in this poem because that comes up relative to both Wordsworth's immersion in nature in this place that mattered to him, and also in relation to his experiences, association with his sister, and how this place was somehow important to them. We talked about the notion of ecstasy in this poem, that Wordsworth seems to derive so much over-the-top kind of pleasure out of being in this space that is important to him, this old abbey that's very much in nature, and Wordsworth above that on the river Wye, W-Y-E, just thinking about that experience of being out in nature. And finally, the term synesthesia is sort of a medical term. It's a neurological impulse by which one thinks of something through one sense and then expresses it through another. So you might perceive the number 3 in terms of sort of a rational or visual way of seeing it, and then you might end up seeing the number 3 for whatever reason as green. That would be, to make that association, would be an example of synesthesia. So that was certainly the most tenuous connection to this poem. We didn't honestly do much with it, except maybe to talk about the idea that Wordsworth is somehow externalizing this memory that he has of having been at this place at that moment with his sister, and that he's going to end up using that to explain that. You can also see, I try and always have a few objectives, so you can see that those kind of 5 or 6 terms, I guess there were 7 terms, were really my objectives for things to make sure that students understood as we began to approach this poem. Clearly the students in this class had read the poem, most of them the year before in their AP English language class, so in some ways there was a great feeling of affinity for the poem, because coming to it a second time can really prove just that much more congenial than it was maybe on your first reading. And so one of the things I asked them to think about as we moved into the poem was a list of 21 questions that I provided to class from Perrine and Arp's book, Sound and Sense. And I just asked which of these feel most important in this poem, recognizing that it's almost like those questions could form a poetry machine into which you might pour a poem and then get your answer back from that. So one of the first questions that we asked was simply, whom do we think the speaker of this poem is? What is the situation in this poem? Those feel like important questions to answer, because the speaker seems to have a pretty dominant voice, and knowing something about him or her helps us to understand perhaps what's happening in the poem. The third thing that happened, so the speaker, quickly, I'm sure that you can see, you can answer this on your own, but we clearly felt that there was some feeling, and it's ineffable, some feeling that it's almost Wordsworth himself. We know he had a strong relationship with his sister Dorothy, who was on some level a muse or amanuensis for him, and so the sympathy that he felt for Dorothy, his sister, might help us to understand why it's easy to project Wordsworth as the speaker of his own poem here. The situation in the poem is seen, as you could see in my underlining, through the words again. The word again shows up on several occasions, and we just see ourselves looking at that and realizing that he's come back to this sacred place that he loves, and we want to just understand that this repetition is important, and that clearly this has been a place where he has had some kind of ecstatic vision before, this feeling of this beautiful, beautiful space. So the situation is, in time, a return to a sacred site so that he's able to move on. And perhaps to apprehend the experience of nature, the profundity of his connection and communion with nature when he was a younger man. If you're following along with the handout, you now know that, of course, we have moved to the second page. We've flipped over, and we are really, on some level, involved with another technique that we use when approaching poetry, especially a relatively long poem such as Tintern Abbey, and that is simply the paraphrase. And so to paraphrase this poem is going to mean, of course, to kind of try to put it in our own words. One of the terms that I talked about in class the other day was the notion of a sense unit. And, a little-known secret about poetry is, though, even though it's laid out typically in lines, and that those are important, most poems are written as sentences. And so for many poems, the sense unit could be the sentence. The sense unit could be, so the sense unit could be the line, it could be the sentence, it could be the stanza, that wonderful Italian word for room. And if you read the poem the other night, I want to say that it was by John Donne, nuns fret not in their convent's narrow room, you know that he's talking about the nature of sonnets, but again, stanza being another kind of sense unit. Unfortunately, after all this, there really isn't a great sense unit in Tintern Abbey because it's this big honkin' poem. The best that I seem to be able to get to is when, almost with a caesura, a kind of break in the line, we see something happening right here where he's come up to some big statement that he needs to make. And I really just want to draw your attention, if I might, to this part because I think it's important. And as we talked about the idea that the sublime, another concept that we could introduce, the sublime is when one is looking into kind of the essence of things. The sublime, typically we talk about today as being associated with the beautiful, but to Wordsworth, the sublime really was this whole idea that one could be approaching the grandeur, the awe-inspiring nature of the natural world. The sublime was ineffable. It kind of went beyond what words could describe, again, toward an idea of transcendence. There are all kinds of really good internet resources on the sublime, and Wordsworth is often credited with really starting and capitalizing on this concept within English Romanticism. So the sublime, as I said, really gets to this notion of awe. To later Romantic poets such as Keats, the sublime might more relate to the sense of awe coming out of fear, and that's really the sort of Gothic turn that the Romantics took later. But in Wordsworth's case, it really was a desire to see God face to face, to pierce the veil and get right to the essence. And in Tintern Abbey, it's when he says, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. I mean, what a beautiful encapsulation of the idea of sublime. And as you can see here, we move pretty easily from that point on into a reconstruction of his experience of returning to Tintern Abbey and seeing either when he is on his pensive couch thinking back on the experience that he's had before, or even being able to return and imagining that river ready to take him in, ready for his soul. You can see the line that I've underlined there. How often, Spirit, have I turned to thee, O sylvan wye, wanderer in the woods? How often has my spirit turned to thee? We talked about the idea there of the inverted syntax, just the notion that he is emphasizing that by virtue of switching the word order as a way of making the subject and verb backwards. You can also note on the second page of Tintern Abbey that Wordsworth seems to be talking about time. He seems to be talking both about the past and his experience of having gone to Tintern Abbey with his sister. In the parts that I've just highlighted here with the arrows, he is talking with the part that begins "and now." He seems to be talking about the present pleasure, as he says, the present pleasure, and also this idea that he's going to get to a future here, that there's going to be something that sustains him when he is tired. He goes back into the past, starting around line 72, as he returns to think about how nature haunted him as a youth, and how sort of primal and immediate his experience of nature was when he was 5 years younger, or indeed younger than he is now. So he has really felt all of that power and really contrasts it with the power of what humans do. Beginning right around line 91, he talks about hearing sometimes the still sad music of humanity, not harsh or grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, and that I, so long a worshipper of nature, thither came unwearied in that service. Rather say with warmer love, oh, with far deeper zeal of holier love, nor now wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear, both for themselves and for thy sake. Again, the idea that he's associating Tintern Abbey, the woods, the river, with his sister, and this moment of communion that clearly was powerful to him, maybe approaching the sublime, unable to be put into words, but perhaps something for him to cherish, as he says in one of his sonnets, for when on pensive couch I lie, to look back on solitude. I think that's the one that he's talking about daffodils. So if you want to look up that poem, it would give you one more insight that this is not necessarily a new idea for Wordsworth, but one that really abides. So that is a fair summary of the experience that is Tintern Abbey. Again, most people felt as if they were returning to an old friend in this case, and there is some degree of friendship and comradeship that is an important part of this poem. But clearly, the reason that it felt important to me was as an introduction to the sublime in the romantic. There's a separate handout that you have via email and posted in our agenda that talks about romanticism in general, and the notion of transcendence will clearly be an important one as we move next tonight into Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. So I would encourage you to think about that, and the Ode to a Nightingale in particular being a great opportunity to think more about transcendence. So that is it for today. Look forward to seeing you.